What's up, guys? This is While Supplies Last, the marketing podcast where we talk about all things business and marketing. I'm Gabby. I'm the marketing manager for Peachtree Rose Marketing, and I do a lot of the market research and search engine optimization for the business.
Hi, I'm Candace. I'm the project manager, and I do a lot of the graphic design and social media management for the business as well. And today, sitting with us, we have Christie Kaye Gallegos. Hello, welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming.
Absolutely.
Yes. We've been working together for a while now. It's nice to actually have you on the podcast. So, yes, thank you for coming in.
Of course, you guys are amazing to work with, so it was an
you
easy
too.
decision to make.
But Christy is the co-founder of Koasis Media. She's also the director of operations and the art director. But today we're going to be talking about the role of creative directing in marketing. And for those of you that don't know, a creative director can be described as a leader who manages the creative process for a project or a brand. So what's one overlooked element of creative direction that can transform a marketing campaign?
That's a great question. To give a little bit of context with the title, because I know that was something that we talked about a bit before the podcast, when you combine operations with art direction, ultimately you get creative direction. And one of the things that's primarily overlooked in campaign development in creative direction is cohesion. More often than not, the assets that get developed in combination with everything else, right? Because creative direction is a holistic outlook on the campaign, whether it's copywriting, photography, graphic design, videography, or even a combination of all of those. It's often that maybe one part of a campaign gets prioritized over others, and it kind of creates a lack of consistency in the communication. And especially in the world of AI and the uncanny valley, when people see that lack of cohesion, it's kind of like a subliminal thought process of a little bit less of a trust building process for them. And that's usually one of the primary things that get overlooked.
Nice.
So, how can businesses effectively collaborate with creatives to get the most out of their marketing campaigns?
That's a really important question, and I think one that more often than not, most people ask. Before I placed a title of creative director or fell into that role, I actually referred to myself more of a creative translator. Mm-hmm. A lot of being a part of that role is being multifaceted in numerous skill sets and being able to speak the language of the creative. And it really is truly like one side of the brain versus the other. When you have operations and you're more analytical, that tends to be what you primarily use to communicate with a client or a marketing director or marketing coordinator, right? Because it's very logistical, strategies involved. You might be talking about ROI and all those fun concepts that are part of developing a strategy for a campaign. But when you're talking to a creative, they're here to exercise their skill set and their trade, and that's all they really focus on. And so logic and that analytics aspect of the campaign is not as much of a focus. And honestly, you don't really want your creative focusing on those things. It's the role of the creative director or the translator to be able to just guide that creative to think in that aspect and just give them the means to create in the light that needs to be created. And so for marketers, it helps. And I think you guys also understand that being both in operations and a bit in creative as well, right, is to just be able to navigate that and to just have a little bit of insight on what it takes to develop these creative assets. A lot of times I recommend to clients or even other marketers before you start looking for that creative team and before you start asking or developing your scope of work, it doesn't take much to just have a little bit of research on what it takes to create those things. It gives a better appreciation, first and foremost, for what's being created, but then gives you the little bit of knowledge and jargon to be able to kind of relate and speak the creative language. So that's definitely one thing that I recommend for marketers is just a little bit of research. getting bit of, that little bit of elbow grease and working in combination with the creatives would be that precious experience to continue to translate, right? This analytical, logistical side of campaign management to the creative development of it.
I know there has to be like that balance. A lot of times I think that I think more creatively than I think analytically, and I always want to jump into the creative stuff.
Yes.
And then when I start getting going, and then I'm like, hold up. I need to start thinking about like, keyword research and what is the ROI on this? Because immediately I'm like, ooh,
this would be so cool.
yes. And I have to always get pulled back a little bit.
Yes.
That's where we balance each other. Because even though I am a creative, when it comes to marketing, I'm more like analytics based. So like we kind of like bounce off each other. So she's like, hey, why don't we do this? And I'm like, but are the people going to like this? What are the numbers going to look like at the end of the day when all this is done?
Yes. That's exactly what that collaboration looks like. It's the same conversations that I have even with my business partners. My business partners, I'm thankful, are professionals in their skill sets in videography, post-production, colorist, photography. But that's the primary conversation is they get very excited and they want to do a really good job and they want to make really cool things. Mm-hmm. But we always kind of have to be like, yes, like I too want to make really cool things and we should make a really cool thing. But let's make sure the cool thing that we make is also hitting these check marks and these key points that are important to the campaign.
For sure.
Yeah.
Right. So how does a creative director tailor each campaign to fit the needs of the client?
How does a creative director tailor? That's a big one because every client's messaging and brand is different. I think the biggest obstacle as a creative director, especially when you're playing both roles as like a marketing coordinator and a creative director, is client education and more so putting the development of the campaign into perspective where the client understands that they may or may not be the target audience. And so with creative directing, a lot of it is almost intuitive, pulling on a lot of the experience that they've had in the years. I started mostly in art before I kind of fell into the role of a creative director. And I'm fortunate that my art journey was catered more so for services of clients. Both my parents are small business owners. So I was 14 designing my first brochure, not understanding what bleed room is when you have print material. And so just being able to see a brand, see the messaging, and sometimes it doesn't exist. More often than not, it doesn't exist. Business owners, especially small business owners, jump into entrepreneurship wanting to provide either a service or a product, but not necessarily taking the time to think about their why and their mission and their vision and their values. And that's a huge part of storytelling and a big part of being able to creatively direct messaging in campaigns. Now, whether that's digital campaigns, print material, even down to just like the voice and tone of how captions or emails are written, like all of those are woven into a brand. And they all subliminally create a ripple effect of how that brand is perceived by people. And so tailor-fitting a campaign is a lot of just understanding and deep diving into, well, what makes this brand special? Right? And sometimes it is a little bit of manufacturing, right? Because if it doesn't exist, it is our role to create it. And making sure that whatever does get created aligns ultimately with the client and brand's values. Because if they didn't have a mission, if they didn't have a vision, the one thing they do have is a value system, as everyone does. And that's that little bit of that like interpersonal, almost like that relationship of a creative director and the brand itself that we have to just kind of channel. It's one thing to paint a picture for yourself, and then it's another to paint a picture for someone else. And like that change in mindset is the primary part of being able to tailor fit something to a specific brand.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that answers that question.
Yes, for sure.
Good. I'm glad.
No, because it is very important. You were saying not a lot of businesses, like whether they're small businesses or not, they don't necessarily have the brand voice.
Right.
So then you have to work a little bit harder to try to like reel that in for them.
Yes. And sometimes that's the difficult part when, collaborating or working with clients who don't have all of that predetermined is sometimes, more often than that is because they don't see the value or understand the importance of it is why they never really focused on developing it, or, time is of the essence. When you're an entrepreneur, you have to wear numerous hats, and being able to verbally, or to write out what that is, they might know it in their head, but they don't have it on paper. And so that's that little extra legwork that you were talking about that needs to be developed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
I'm sure you guys experience that quite a bit.
Yeah, like you said, they have it in the back of their mind, but like you need to be able to communicate it to
Others.
Yeah, others, so that they can help you communicate, your brand in all the visuals and, like you said, in the tone and the voice. So they have an idea of what it should be, but it's like, tell me.
Yes.
And they're like, it's like, well, is it written? Do you have anything written down? Do you have brand guidelines written down? And a lot of times they don't have those things already set in place,
Right.
Because they've already hit the ground running,
Right.
And so you're kind of backtracking and trying to create stuff while also still providing the service that they originally
asked
for, because you're like, okay, well, I got to do some leg work.
Yes.
In the back end. But how does a creative director translate strategic objectives to something that's visually enhanced?
Yes. That's
or engaging.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And is this communicating in terms of to a creative or just in the development as a whole?
Development as a whole.
Got it. So again, going back to translation, a lot of it, and that's honestly, it's something that I find myself having to hone in more so than not, is being able to almost justify the reasons why a certain direction outweighs another. A lot of times it's truly looking at the target audience and putting myself in their shoes. And empathy is a really big part of that, right? Because creative direction is storytelling with objectives, ultimately. And so when it comes to developing it, my first step usually is to create a vision board. And that can look like a number of different ways with people, but, going back to just the way individuals process information, I've learned that vision boards, even as a simple one, it could be no more than 10 pictures put together, is enough to serve as a foundation for everyone to refer back to. Because it's easy to get lost in the creative process, right? Is you start with the direction and then you start actually developing it, finding, so for example, with photography, finding the models, right? Are those models a good fit for the product? Are those models a reflection of the target audience? Do they resonate with the type of diversity that we're having involved, Or even with set design, right? Is the set design aligning with the brand? Are we focusing too much on the story and not enough on the product, right? And there's this back and forth that happens. It takes a lot of experience to be able to nail it right on the head every single time. But the one thing I've learned is options are key. And especially when you're collaborating, not just with the client, but also with the creative team, having visuals and having those visuals display options of direction and kind of aligning everyone on the same page is the primary role of a creative director, right? So when a campaign needs to be developed and say a client does have, their mission, vision, and brand voice, or at least a good indication of what it is. And they say, okay, well, I need a campaign that's going to raise brand awareness for this new product launch that we're rolling out in the next X amount of months, right? It's being able to take their needs, assess budget, assess timeline, what's actually feasible in this campaign to develop in the time that we need to, and then sourcing that talent, and then sourcing the direction. With clients in particular, it's always helpful to show them a reference. Sometimes it bites you in the butt because they think that's exactly what they're going to get, which is one thing that constantly happens, especially in the world of content. Everything is accessible. They see one thing they really, really like. They're like, oh, I want this. And then that's where that client education comes in. So, well, you really like it, and that's great. Like, this could be a reference point, but it shouldn't be exactly what we're going to be creating because you're not them, right? And their target audience isn't yours. Let's make something special and unique for you that properly represents your brand and your messaging, but also hits these objectives based off of what the, goals are for that brand awareness, whether that's engagement, whether that's click-throughs, the numerous amount of call to actions that campaigns have, and just get it all aligned. And so vision boards are helpful reference points. And then obviously putting that in a pitch deck or some sort of creative brief proposal that you can refer back to. And a creative brief honestly serves as a Bible for everyone to understand what's being developed, why it's being developed, and then if there's any questions or if there's any pivots during that creative process, it's a little bit easier to kind of navigate what those pivots are, knowing that there's already a pre-established justification, research, data as to why it's being developed a certain way.
So you said you said for like clients, you tend to provide options. How many options do you usually give them?
At least 3. I know that sometimes that too can be a little funny of a process. I'll end up making 2 that I'm just like, these are great. And then the third one's like, this one's just a nice to have, but these other 2 are the ones that I really, really think are going to do it. And then sometimes the client's just like, I like the third. And it's like,
Of course you do.
Yes. And like there's that little bit of that like give and take. At the end of the day, we are providing a service. And although it may not be exactly what we want, right, we have to just make sure ultimately that we're providing the goals and results that the client needs. And that's that kind of like back and forth, right, with working with creatives and providing a service. Providing a service is serving others, creating art for yourself is self-serving. And so having to navigate those 2 is sometimes a little bit difficult. But I always at least offer 3. And I try to provide mock-ups if I can. It's a little bit, again, going back to that timeline based off of really how much time I have to pre-develop something in order for them to kind of understand, again, those references and having those visuals help. But 3 tends to be a safe number.
Yeah, because I've seen that a lot in the community, like, giving 3 options, but I've also seen people that only give 1 option. Mm-hmm. And I guess with the fact that they tend to, the more options you give a client, sometimes that can make things tricky as far as the decision making.
Yes.
So how do you feel about like people that only give 1 option? Is that like something that would be doable or should be done if they have like a limited time frame?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say so. It's all about the scenario and the landscape in which the service is being provided. I think a lot of it also kind of lands on how much involvement the client actually wants. That's a big one. I've always landed on 3 because our stance as Koasis Media is creative partners. we are the middle ground between working with an independent freelancer versus working with, a corporate agency. We meet clients in the middle, which means that we acknowledge that sometimes the clients do have, precious marketing experience and do want a say in what is created for their company or brand. And sometimes they don't, and they want to lean on an expert to develop that for them. And so that's kind of the gauge, I think, is ultimately time, feasibility, and then involvement. When clients who say don't want to have as much involvement, more often than not, those are larger corporations where there's a lot of things happening, moving parts. They know they need this campaign developed, which maybe they don't have an in-house marketing department for, or their in-house marketing department doesn't have the bandwidth to take this on or the skill sets to create something a little bit out of the usual. And that's why they would seek a third-party vendor in order to step in. But when you're in that role or when you're in that dynamic, it is a little bit safer just be like, oh, well, if we're coming in as the experts, then they're giving us the freedom to really narrow down what that direction should be. And I think then with that trust and that dynamic, one option's totally fine. On the flip side, say they're a lot smaller and they don't have a marketing department or social media manager or any marketing support. They tend to be a little bit more micromanagement on the micromanagement side because they're having to wear so many hats. And that's why, providing options is a little bit more helpful. But going back to that client education, right? If we're also solving the problem of, hey, you wear so many hats, you don't have a lot of time to provide in this collaboration, and that's okay. Know that we're operating completely with your best interests in mind, then I might actually just provide two options. So that's just a little bit less involvement, but at the very least, they still feel like they have the freedom to be a part of the process. So that's ultimately kind of like my mindset is there's really no like right or wrong answer. It's just more so what that landscape looks like with the service, client involvement, and obviously feasibility.
Okay. Because I know you did talk about like the design brief and client education.
Yes.
Can you speak to the importance of, I guess, the like clients in the brief, them providing feedback as well? Just off topic.
Tangent.
Yeah. With getting their feedback or getting their participation, have you ever had a client that was just really hands off, even though they were like small, like
Right.
a small business, but they were hands off because they're so focused on their client work and all the things that they need to do, trying to get them to see the importance of like being involved in the creative process? Because I know a lot of times, yes, they do believe like, oh, that's all you.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's like, I need you to be involved in the creative process. So how do you handle that kind of collaboration?
Right. Or the lack thereof.
Yeah.
Right. No, I think any creative can definitely understand what that means and what you're trying to explain. Every now and then, when that client comes around, it's more so. I feel like a lot of it is in that pre-production and establishing that dynamic. It's one thing for them to want to be involved, and then when time comes to it, they don't have the ability to be involved. I always try to make sure that they understand the consequences, and that sounds kind of weird, but like the outcome of what that may result in, right? And I want to make sure that the client is satisfied with whatever's being created. And not having feedback or another big thing that happens is they take a very long time to provide that feedback. And in turn, that only lengthens the timeline of how things are created and the process in which we had pre-established. Because more, in the creative brief, It should outline not just like the art direction, but a little bit of just like fundamental information about the brand, the mission, the vision, purpose, your unique value proposition, messaging, brand voice. Nothing outrageously long, right? You're not trying to recreate their brand guide for them, right? But just like key points, bullets, if anything. And hopefully, at least in the beginning of that dynamic, you got that from the client. When it comes to the actual pitching of like the options, for example, and them not providing that feedback, it's more so just, again, that client education. It's like, hey, we have a timeline. We're trying to meet this goal that you originally came to us for. We really need this insight. And more often than not, it's mostly a lot of follow-ups. It's just, hey, looking to get this moving by the end of this week. And sometimes it becomes very evident that the initial, sometimes a immediate timeline that clients provide is more so just a manifestation of their sense of urgency, and sometimes it doesn't really actually have that really hard set deadline. So communication's really key. Sometimes I actually suggest, is there a better point of contact that has the ability to provide this feedback that you trust, right? And that's giving them the option to delegate that time. So I try to approach it from that standpoint, but sometimes you just have your hands tied, right? Especially when you're working with, a really quick turnaround. I definitely don't encourage, the creation of assets without that feedback. And that's just something that I communicate because it's going to cost more to correct the art direction if assets have already been created than it is to just kind of put a halt on the time and just kind of find realigned communications with the client. But I've had the flip side where they actually, took those options to provide a little bit too much feedback. So it's really just, finding that middle ground. Really, again, putting yourself in their shoes, especially with smaller clients that don't have the time to provide that insight. Client education, giving them the option to delegate, or at the very least, getting written consent to move forward regardless of, their feedback. Because again, at the end of the day, we are operating with their goals in mind and wanting to do the best for the brand. So even if a client may or may not like what is produced, the goal is to give them results. And it's a lot easier for clients to be like, oh, I may not like what was developed, but it's hitting all of the marks and the goals that we originally knew were important. And then from there, a little bit more communications. But that's going to happen. That's part of just providing a service.
Okay. That was way off topic. But
No, I think it's
good.
important. Yeah, absolutely. Client dynamic is something that only really with experience you can kind of talk about and learn. And it's one of the things that I feel most creatives, especially green ones that are entering the field, have the most questions about. Just how do I handle situations like this?
what is the process of building a successful team to execute a campaign?
Got it. Yes. So I feel very fortunate that with Koasis Media, we are primarily a media collective. And that's what allows us to be in that middle ground between freelancer and corporation. In other words, we have a network or directory of creatives we've either worked with before, kind of gelled with, learned, if we work well together. And I have also made sure that we've seen their work. Now, whether that's portfolio is one way. We tend to take portfolio with a grain of salt and want to give them an opportunity to showcase what they can actually create during a very non-abrasive project. So a lot of what Koasis does is that initial legwork to essentially be able to look at our landscape of creatives and pull the ones that are best fit for a brand. Now, that's a very interesting question because it really isn't always about skill set, truly. You also want to make sure that the experience that the client has, especially if they are very much involved, say on set, say the campaign involved developing a company overview video, right? You're going to have crew on location. They're going to be talking and working with either directly with the client or with the talent that's being interviewed, right? And you want to make sure that those creatives provide an experience or at least align in values with the client itself and the brand. That experience is an important key to, on the more service side, elevate the justification in partnering with like a company such as Koasis Media, but also making sure that the creative process is being nurtured and not developing friction. When it comes to developing creative assets and the creative process in mind, a lot of people forget that culture is a really big part of that. And so kind of going back to your original question is, what does it look like to like essentially source the creatives to contribute to a successful campaign? It's really not always about the portfolio. You want to make sure that what gets produced is amazing. And so there has to be some level of skill set. But to round it off in a successful outlook or holistic approach to the collaboration, it's also the culture, their values, their style. That's a big one. Making sure they have, if they don't specifically have a style that resonates with the brand, they have the range to encapsulate that brand's image. And truly, that creative brief is a big part of that. The creative brief tends to be created before a crew gets sourced or a creative team gets sourced. That creative brief then gets presented, and it's just like you kind of do your own vetting process. Okay, of my 20 graphic designers that I have in my Rolodex, right? I know that 10 of those focus more so, say, on like illustrative work. So that's really great when you're dealing with direct-to-consumer type brands, so like products, especially if you're working with brands that, say, are female-led and tend to use a lot more of like a bright color palette. You wouldn't want to source a designer that only creates moody assets, right? You want to make sure that they have an existing portfolio, one that they enjoy. That's a big one. Back to creative process. That aligns with the values of the client. So it is a lot of people skills and vetting in that process. And quality control is part of being a creative director and making sure the things that get produced are beautiful. And being multifaceted and that translator allows that vetting process to go a little bit more smoothly. So that's kind of my approach. Is I also make sure that culture is a really big part of that.
Right. So you said quality control is a big part of creative direction. How would you say art direction and marketing direction differ from creative direction?
Absolutely. So let's start with marketing, right? So marketing coordination strategy tends to be a little bit more on the analytical side, where it's a psychology almost, right? It's being able to identify the target audience given whatever research or data is available. Now, whether that's something that comes from the client or is found elsewhere, it makes no difference, right? And a marketing coordinator or director is here to streamline kind of like that pathway of what that strategy is going to look like. A creative director's role, right, is in between kind of that art direction and that marketing coordination or marketing direction. And they're that translator and that in-between between the marketer and the creative. So they're multifaceted in terms of being able to have the experience and skill set to talk to the creative, but they're also very analytical and operations-based to be able to collaborate with a marketer. Now, art direction is more minute, right? It's almost a scale, almost like a spectrum, right? Where it's one side of your brain to the other. And art direction tends to be as minute as like set design, right? Where a creative director can put together all the references. So this is what we need it to look like based off of the data that the marketer had provided with the target audience. It's the art director's role on set during the creative development of the assets to manifest that. And so that's why I say it's a little bit like the spectrum, right? Left side of your brain to right side of the brain. and all of the skill sets and roles that these people play are exactly what is necessary to develop a successful campaign. And so that's kind of like how I would kind of categorize them. And their involvement in the development process all look a little bit different. Since Koasis is a small team, we run lean at the core of it all. I tend to have to wear those hats more often than not. With the client, I'm talking on a marketing's perspective and explaining, based off of insights and what information we have collected to put together what that timeline and goals should look like. As a creative director, I have to take that information and find the team to produce that. And more often than not, I start with my core members, of course, and we work together to develop it. But then I'm also on set, sourcing the props, sourcing the talent, sourcing and approving the frame, for example, on what does the end video going to look like. And as a graphic designer, so many hats. As a graphic designer, right, which is where I initially started, being able to take those photos or the video and elevate it. And now this photo we can integrate graphics, and that's part of the campaign. Or in this video, I can create motion graphics that further instill whatever the message is being communicated and therefore add on to the video's impact. And then that becomes a part of the campaign. And all of those tend to get delivered to a marketing coordinator, and they work within their team to get that content distributed. But as of late, we've kind of expanded into marketing and advertising services ourselves with the help with Peachtree Rose Marketing. And so, having that distribution that's the implementation that's really important with the campaign. So I hope that in a long roundabout way does answer your question on like where each of those roles lie. You will, especially with small organizations, you will find someone who's wearing all three of those hats, and that's okay. But in larger scale productions, those roles tend to be individualized, and you have people specifically working in that dynamic.
That's perfect.
And I know you touched on it a little bit, but could you go more into how you got into creative direction and art direction?
Yes, absolutely. Out of necessity is the very short story of it all. Kind of going back to our beginning of our conversation, I was 14 designing trifolds and business cards and understanding how all of that plays into marketing, right? And being in and growing up around small business, and I will say that I think my mom's a really big influence in how my outlook is on providing a service, is truly being able to connect and relate with people. And so psychology, I'm a big fan of. And that was my favorite thing in college, was reading scientific journals on just how different things trigger or, provide a response from a person. And art is a really big part of that, right? And you think about museums and fine art and how people go in and they're standing and staring at an image for hours. If three people are looking at the same image, more like depending on those people, of course, they're all going to have very different perspectives on how they're interpreting a piece. And that's a big part of developing campaigns and creative direction, right? So from graphic design, I then kind of migrated into social media, because during my journey, social media was really expanding and becoming more pronounced in our everyday lives, and seeing that evolve over the years, and how now I think for a long time the hot word was humanization, and making sure that you're leading with authenticity is a big part of storytelling. So when I found my now business partners, Noelle and Darren, again, I feel very blessed to have them two by my side as Koasis. We are a spectrum of experience. I'm on the cusp of Gen Z millennial. Noelle, our in-house lead photographer, is a millennial. And then our, Darren, our videographer, colorist, is Gen X. And so he basically has 30 plus years of experience in media production, actually came from photojournalism. So journalism is a really big part of what he brings to the table in this unbiased approach to storytelling. There's nothing, you would hope, more authentic than journalism, right? I know in our current climate, that's a bit interesting right now. But that's what he instilled in me, learning about his experience and kind of me entering this role as a creative director. I didn't start using that title, till maybe like a year ago. I didn't realize I was operating in that role or that it even existed until, like 3 years into running a media production company. I didn't understand how important it was either. I just knew that I wanted to create amazing things with professionals and amazing creatives that had impact for a client. And it just so happened that role made sense for me. So an example of that, right, is we worked with a client called Plus One Robotics during the pandemic. And they are in the automation world. So they create vision softwares for like robotic arms that you would normally see in warehouses. And that vision software, basically bridges the gap in that one-to-one automation of like robot to human to that other side of the spectrum where it's one human and like hundreds of robots, right? So they meet in the middle. And we were tasked with helping develop assets for an international campaign that they were going to, really push because they also were finding themselves in like Europe, obviously, and trying to expand their business. And, I remember working on that project, not really understanding the role that I was in, but developing the script from scratch, hearing the needs of the client on what they wanted to communicate, developing the script, and then that creative direction, right? It's like, how can we differentiate, this company from all of the other vision softwares there are? And when you look at the tech industry, there is a motif in design and approach. And more often than not, right, you think tech and it's like all of these little connections and dots, right? It's all almost very sterile as well, in technology. And I wanted to take that and elevate that and like really give them something that was unique. And so with the script in mind, I was like, how awesome would it be if we got a voice actress that sounded like Siri? Everyone can relate to Siri. Yeah. That's a voice that everyone can identify with. I'm like, okay, cool. And with collaborating with the creative team that I had sourced, there exactly was that, a voice actress, I believe her name was Belinda, who legitimately sounded like a robot. Naturally, with no alterations. The way she paced herself in her voice, her enunciation was perfect. And so I essentially, scripted this dramatized version of what it means to have a vision software and automation, sourced the voice talent that elevated that experience, worked with a sound engineer to add in sound effects, because the robot itself, obviously has its own natural sounds, and it was this particular robot used suction cups in order to depalletize pallets. And so with every movement of the arm, you heard the articulation of the mechanics inside of it, which were totally not actually from the set, all like manufactured. And even during production, I'm on set helping approve the frames, not realizing, oh, this is what a creative director does. And one of the biggest obstacles when we came on set was, they had their giant warehouse and all of their different, robotic arms within the warehouse. But this dramatization, my vision was, oh, how cool would it be if this robot was the only thing in an empty warehouse and like everything was void and there was a spotlight on this robotic arm, right? How do you do that when this robotic arm is amongst an actually functioning warehouse? And so day of production, we brought a bunch of black curtains, duvets, and hand-pinned around this enclosure that it already was in. Bunch of black curtains. So in the final video, it literally looked like it was in a black void. And we lit it to where we had these giant lights that we turn off the actual like warehouse lights, which created its own issues, by the way, that I didn't really realize until I was working with the engineer saying, hey, why is the robot having difficulties depalletizing the pallet? And we realized, oh, it's because it's used to working under warehouse lighting, and we like altered its lighting in general. So we actually had to work with the engineers to make sure that the lighting that we had on set was bright enough for the robotic arm to operate. And so you had script writing, sourcing of talent, a bit of set design, right? Approving frame, like I created a little bit of a storyboard, and then working with the engineers to creative problem solve during that day. And like, that is one of my favorite projects and outcomes. And a creative asset is developed well when you watch it and you don't even notice, all the different parts that are a part of it, right? If you watched a good movie, the message will stay with you. You won't necessarily realize, all of this effort in sound design, in, production was a part of it. No, you leave and you're like, oh, that was an amazing story. Versus if you watch a bad movie and it's like, there's a microphone in frame, or like that, those special effects don't look very realistic. You don't leave the, movie theater thinking, oh, that was a great story. You leave a little chuckling saying, oh, that was kind of funny, because it broke the immersion that it was intended to have. And again, I think that all kind of goes back to, perception and how art plays in all of this, is you want to make sure that whatever is being developed does immerse your audience and instills something and evokes something in response. And if you can do that, that is creative direction in entirety. I hope that answers your question.
Yes. And then it just led me to think, I was like, oh, I literally was just watching, I was trying to find the trailer for this new scary movie that was coming out. But instead of the trailer, it was showing me like a short video of the guy that actually was creating the score for the music, and like the different instruments that he was using and then it was showing like scenes in which the music was, and I was like, wow, oh my gosh, this is so cool. And then you don't even think about it like while you're watching, that this is this type of stuff that's going on behind the scenes, or that is actually making that experience. And so I think like that translating into the art direction for like a marketing campaign or something, people don't think about all those different things that could go into creating something like that for their business. And that's, something that they could probably put at the top of their mind. Now, how would you say someone could translate something of, I guess, that magnitude for like a small business? Like if they wanted to create something, not necessarily, because obviously budget-wise, they may have a limited budget, but kind of have those things in mind of the different processes and steps that it would take to create something seamless that could give them that same feeling, or budget-friendly ways for them to do storytelling.
Yes. That's a great like pivot from what we were just talking about, because it really isn't about your equipment. And a lot of people think that it's about the equipment. It helps, right? Like being able to have, 4K footage is great, only because 4K footage allows you the flexibility to punch in and be a little bit more precise on what your composition looks like in the end product. Because at the end of the day, it's probably going to be consumed at 1080p.
Yeah.
It's like our phones are also amazing tools. We can record slow-mo. We can change frames per second. We can record in 4K on our phones. And I think, more often than not, a lot of times people assume, I have to invest in high dollar equipment if I'm going to create something that's, elevated. But that's not always the case. Storytelling has been something that humans have done since the dawn of time. Stories are how we've actually, carried along culture, how we communicated dangers back in the day, right? Like, and arguably still is. I mean, storytelling is a big part of the human experience. And when you think about the essence of storytelling, during the settlement of America, for example, there wasn't no Reds or Leicas to shoot all of these stories, right? Like, it was word of mouth. And I think a lot of that can be translated to that budget-friendly approach, right? We already have the tools, right? We know what it means to be immersed in a story. Now, dissecting that story is something I don't think a lot of people realize, right? When you're little and you're hearing like folklore from like your grandma about, kukui or whatever, right? The way she told that story probably freaked you out as a kid, And it's truly about the way it's communicated. Now, stories fluctuate, or how things are told fluctuate depending on, the scenario. I think nowadays, since we're in a world of short form content, it's actually been interesting to see how humans, we have evolved to being able to communicate a story in like less than 30 seconds. Right. Like, that's fascinating if you really think about it, Yeah, and it's funny, later today, not to date this podcast, but we're actually going to be having like a campfire ghost story event where we're going to go around and actually tell the stories. And that's one of the things that I've been thinking about, is like, how can I, tell the story of like a Filipino folklore in a way that, gets people immersed. And how do I do that without taking up the entire, hour of time? There's other people who have to tell stories too. And so when it comes to the budget friendly, and that's my biggest thing, is like, don't worry too much about the equipment. You already have the tools. Really focused on how you're crafting that story. And then understand, what people are really looking for. Going back to those keywords, authenticity. Going back to those keywords of just being genuine and expressing your why. A lot of times people focus a little too much on the what, right? And I think there should be content that focuses on the what for the people who don't have the time or ability to immerse themselves in whatever story. You just want to get to the point. This is what it is. But for those who do and who care about the why, focusing on the why instead of the what makes it that much easier to create budget-friendly storytelling. I mean, you see accounts, online where all they do are voiceovers, right? And it's just a bunch of B-roll or source stock footage. Or it's done on their phone and they have a voiceover that kind of explains what's going on. Like, that is an approach to storytelling. And it gets more minute than that, right? Because sometimes you have the ability or the means to spend a little extra time on telling a story, and you might want to change things around, right? Every story has a beginning, middle, and end. But how many times have you seen movies where it starts with the end, and then you go back to the beginning to figure out how you got to the end, right? Being able to understand a story arc and a narrative, and to get good at least the fundamentals is the first way to go. Once you get good at least doing the fundamentals, then you can kind of, how about we start with the problem, and then we can talk about the journey and then end with the solution. Being able to manipulate that at the end is part of becoming a better storyteller. And that's ultimately what it is the answer to producing budget-friendly content that's going to have impact is just becoming a better storyteller.
Oh, the way a story is aligned, it made me think of the foreshadowing trend on TikTok.
Oh, yes. Yes.
So I'm just thinking like they're showing somebody like starting to fall down the stairs, and then they're showing what like led up to that point.
Yes, exactly. And then that, with social media, again, the short form storytelling, like, those are hooks. Yeah. Those are the first, you especially in social media, like TikTok or Instagram, when you're scrolling through Reels, you literally have 2 to 3 seconds before that person swipes to the next content. So what do you do in those first 3 seconds to keep them engaged? And that is a form of that.
So, what would you say is a common mistake that businesses make when they're executing a marketing campaign without any creative direction, and how can they avoid it?
Can you ask that question one more time?
Yeah, so what's a common mistake that businesses make whenever they're executing a marketing campaign and there's no creative direction? What can they do to avoid any of those mistakes?
Got it. I think the most common mistake is thinking that, because I'm assuming this is like an independent business owner, right? And they are trying to run their marketing efforts. And kind of going back to what I had mentioned earlier, a lot of times they think they're their target audience, right?
Yeah.
And so when they are making things that they like, it's probably not creating the same results or perception that their target audience is engaged with. I think empathy is a really big part of that, and putting people in their shoes, meeting your clients where they are, or customers where they are, is a big part of that. And just understanding that, yeah, you may not always, you probably aren't the target audience of your own brand. And that's okay, because it evolves, right? And people evolve. So number one would just be to remove yourself from this, at least mentally remove yourself from the mindset that you are the business owner creating the content. Like, imagine yourself in the shoes of the customer. And if I were a customer purchasing something from a brand, what would resonate with me? And again, sometimes that means that you have to do a little bit of research. And so talking with even friends and family is a good start. Or straight up just outreaching to your audience. I think that's a part that a lot of people forget about social media, is that it starts with the word social, and that you have, all the study groups or focus groups that you need to get feedback. Allowing the customer to be a part of your journey is an easy way to do that as well. And creative direction, has 2 points. You have the aesthetics, right? The appearance of things, and then you have the functionality of things. Merging the two together is how you create that, successful outcome. But when you are a business of one, you sometimes don't really have the luxury of focusing all on the aesthetics. And that's okay. A lot of people get discouraged, and then it kind of goes back to that mindset of just I need high-end equipment, or I need a videographer to do this. And again, we have those tools already. So I guess my recommendation to just be able to, not fall into those pits when creating content for your own brand, for whatever efforts they may be, is to, one, put yourself in your customer's shoes. Ask for feedback. Straight up, and more often than not, people are happy to give it to you. And then lastly would be to, again, references. Look at other brands and how they're storytelling. And maybe even just starting with following that same template, not copying it exactly, but following that same template, right, allows you to gain that little bit of experience to then go back to being a better storyteller. And then as soon as you're a better storyteller, you keep getting feedback, you keep elevating or getting experience in using whatever tools are accessible to you. You'll end up becoming that creative director in the long run. And you will end up finding yourself being able to communicate to other creatives or other people who can help you then elevate your content. But it is a lot of just letting go of that ego of just, I'm going to do it all because it's my brand and this is where I know I need to go. It's not because these clients or business owners don't know what they're doing. I think the actual issue is that they're just too close to it. And I can say that for myself too. I mean, even with Koasis, I was in a creative rut for I don't know how many months because I wanted to rebrand the company. And I was like, I don't know where I want to go with this, right? I knew the essence of what I wanted, but I actually asked for help. I went to my friend Austin Moncada. He's also a fellow amazing creative director, also multifaceted, and his values was very apparent that aligned with ours. And I actually went to him and said, hey, I need I'm too close to this. Can you help me kind of, navigate this next chapter of Koasis's branding? And he did. And that's our branding now. He's amazing at what he does. And so I trusted that and collaborated with him. And same thing, he also offered a couple of options. So that in itself is probably my biggest recommendation, to lean on your community.
So why is creative consistency important, and how does it translate to better customer engagement?
That's a great question. Mainly because it kind of goes back to how people perceive things. With the surge of AI and how it's very apparent when things are just off is like a more intense example of how that plays with your brand image, right? And there's things that, are, I guess, I don't know if it's allowed, but are within the realm of navigating that quality control, because not every image has to be crystal clear and beautiful, right? It kind of goes back to the storytelling. If it serves a purpose and it serves a why, then it wouldn't take much to alter it just slightly, whether that's copy or like a filter that matches your brand image a little bit better, and just like reusing, for example, user-generated content, right? User-generated content's not usually created with high-end equipment, but it tells a story that's worth telling because it's coming from someone who is validating why a brand is worth supporting. And so I lost a little bit of my train of thought, but you were talking about
A creative consistency and how it helps with customer engagement.
Right. There you go. Customer engagement is ultimately built on trust. And when it is very apparent that a brand is inconsistent, it hinders that trust. I mean, that's ultimately what moves people to do anything, is being able to know that whatever they are supporting or whatever they are sharing to their own people and their own audience aligns with them. And having a drastic change in that, and sometimes it's not that drastic, can hinder those relationships that you built online. And it's really just that perception. So, in other words, it's not really about the content, it's about the message. Say you go from, storytelling about, say your brand is in environmentalism, and you are selling or communicating why it's important to use multi-use products. So things that are refillable, right? So you can reduce your waste output. And you're talking about, the waterways, and you're talking about, our environment, and expressing how it's important that we do all of this. That messaging is really about your why and mission. But then you go into, that brand you shouldn't support this brand because this came out. And now you're pivoting from this is why I do it to essentially, not aligning with the values of your target audience and focusing on arguably slander in that example to try to elevate yourself. That pivot in values, whether it's true or not, right? Like whether that person actually feels that way or not, is going to create friction for the audience that you've built. More often than not, the people who want to support initiatives in environmentalism, peace, love, and sincerity, right? Like they're wanting to do good for the world. They want to feel good doing good for the world. And using, anger or this lack of sportsmanship is going to drive people away. And that's ultimately what that question is about, is your messaging. As soon as you start moving away from your why or focusing a little too much on the what, people start losing focus on the values that they aligned with in the beginning. And it's a shame, I see a lot of it, especially in like the artist world, where it becomes less about the art and more about not receiving opportunities or feeling like the world's against them, and results in just this negative messaging. And that's how you lose. That's how you lose people. Or on the flip side, you gain people who are also mad at the same thing, and now you just have a bunch of very strong-willed audience that are ready to, unfortunately, feed off of that. And not to make it spiritual and talk about energy, but ultimately that's really what it is making sure that whatever messaging, regardless of the content quality, is consistent, because you want to make sure that those values are being communicated at all times. And that's, I guess, my long roundabout approach to your question.
Very good.
Thank you.
Oh, that's great. Well, that wraps up the episode. Thank you, Christie, for coming on.
Yes. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
I could talk all day with you guys. This was really fun.
Yes, it was fun. We can talk a lot more too.
Yeah.
Later on.
Definitely.
But where can the people find you online and Koasis Media?
Yes, absolutely. A little bit of a plug-in. Feel free to visit us on our website at koasismedia.com. I've spent a lot of time really elevating that platform. You can find all of our portfolio. We have a couple of initiatives that are coming out specifically to support our food and beverage community here in San Antonio. But you can find us basically on most social media platforms, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, so on and so forth. Even Pinterest, which is something I need to pour a little bit more energy into, under at Koasis Media.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, guys.
Of course. So once again, this is While Supplies Last, the marketing podcast. Please like, share, and subscribe. We're on YouTube. And then we're also with Peachtree Rose Marketing. You can find us on Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook under the same name. But thanks again. We loved having you.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, guys.
See you guys next time.
See you next time. Bye.